The sun was still low when the explorer started his climb that morning. The cold air moved softly through the tall pine trees, carrying a silence that felt almost too perfect. He had spent years walking through wild places where no one lived, but this mountain range was different. It was quiet in a way that made him feel like he was being watched, though he knew no one was there. His boots pressed into the snow with slow, careful steps as he followed a narrow trail. He was used to tough journeys. The wilderness had always felt like home to him. He trusted the mountains, trusted their silence. But that morning something felt off. He carried only the things he needed. A backpack with food, water, a flashlight, a camera, and a radio. The wind picked up as he walked higher, and the trees started to thin. He wiped the frost off his jacket and kept moving. His goal that day was simple: reach a high ridge and document unusual rock formations that had been spotted in satellite images. But fate had other plans. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he stepped off that ridge, his life would never be the same. As the sun climbed higher, a strange reflection caught his eye. At first it was just a flash, like sunlight bouncing off glass or metal. He stopped and squinted into the distance. Up ahead through the bare trees something was shining. That made no sense. There was nothing man-made out here. No towns, no roads, no buildings. He pulled out his small binoculars and focused on the spot. His heart skipped a beat. Something huge was sitting in the middle of the forest. It was silver, curved and partly covered in snow. He moved closer slowly, carefully, his boots crunching through frozen branches. The wind had gone quiet again, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As he stepped out from behind the last row of trees, his jaw dropped. In front of him was something so impossible, so unreal, that for a moment he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. It was a cruise ship. A massive cruise ship, sitting in the middle of the mountains. The size of it was overwhelming. The hull stretched across the clearing like a sleeping giant. Rust streaked its sides, and trees had grown around the bow as if trying to swallow it whole. Snow covered the decks, but the tall white structure still looked proud, like it was waiting to sail again. He slowly walked closer, his hands shaking. The nearest ocean was hundreds of miles away. How could something this big be here? He reached the edge of the ship and placed his hand against the cold metal. It felt real. Not a dream, not a trick of the eyes. The name was still faintly visible on the side, letters almost rubbed away by time and weather. It looked like the ship had been here for years, maybe decades. But how? No road could have brought it here. No storm could have carried it this far. The mountain air felt heavier now, as if the weight of the ship pressed down on the land itself. He took a few steps back and turned on his camera. His voice trembled as he whispered into the microphone, trying to explain what he was seeing. It sounded strange even to him. A massive ocean liner stranded in the middle of nowhere. It felt like the opening scene of a mystery film, only this was real. He circled the ship slowly, filming every angle. Broken windows gaped like empty eyes. Paint peeled from the sides. A staircase hung from one corner, twisted and frozen. There were no footprints around it, no sign of other people. It was untouched. He pulled out his radio and called for a signal. The connection was weak this high up, but his voice crackled through. He reported the coordinates and tried to explain what he'd found. The person on the other end thought it was a joke at first. Who wouldn't? A cruise ship in the mountains sounded like something made up. But the seriousness in his voice eventually made them listen. A small team promised to join him in the coming days. He knew he couldn't explore the inside alone. Something this strange needed careful hands still. He couldn't just walk away. He wanted to see more. He climbed up a broken ladder that led to the lower deck. The metal groaned beneath his boots, echoing through the cold air. Snow crunched under his feet as he stepped onto the deck. The silence up there was even stronger. It felt like stepping into another world. The railings were bent, but the structure was surprisingly intact. He walked slowly, brushing away layers of snow and dirt. Everything felt frozen in time. He peeked through a broken window into what looked like a dining area. Tables and chairs were still there, though some were tipped over. Curtains hung in shreds. A chandelier once grand dangled from the ceiling, its glass pieces shattered. It was as if everyone had left in a hurry and never returned. His breath fogged the air as he stared inside, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. The wind picked up suddenly, howling around the empty decks. It made the loose metal creak, a sound that echoed like a voice calling from deep inside the ship. He gripped the railing tighter and looked out at the forest. From up there, the trees looked small, like a green ocean surrounding a stranded vessel. The image was surreal. A ship without water. A journey without direction. A story waiting to be told. He decided not to enter fully. It was too dangerous to go alone. The ship was old, rusted, and could collapse in some parts. But he did want proof. He set his camera on the deck and recorded a long, slow pan of the entire structure. This wasn't a trick of the light or a hidden prop, it was real. A full-sized cruise ship sitting quietly in the snow, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. As the day moved on, the sun cast long shadows over the metal giant. He set up a small camp not far from the ship, near the tree line where the ground was flat. He made a fire, ate a quick meal, and kept glancing at the massive structure in front of him. It almost felt alive in the firelight, the way the shadows shifted over its sides. Every creak from the metal made him turn his head. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a discovery. It was a message from the past. He thought about the people who might have been on board. Families, travelers, workers. Where did they go? How did the ship get here? His mind ran through every possible explanation. A storm? An old military operation? Some freak accident? None of it made sense. And that made the mystery even stronger. That night he could barely sleep. The forest around him was silent except for the occasional sound of snow sliding off branches. But the ship seemed to make its own sounds. Metal shifted with the wind. Pipes clinked softly like footsteps far away. He lay in his sleeping bag staring up at the stars, wondering if anyone else in the world had ever seen what he was seeing now. At one point in the night, he got up and walked a little closer to the hull. The moonlight was bright and the ship looked even stranger in the silver glow. He placed his hand against the cold metal again and closed his eyes for a moment. It was like touching a piece of history that no one remembered. He whispered quietly to himself, promising that he would find out the truth. No matter how strange it was, morning came slowly. The air was crisp and still. He packed up his things but didn't leave. Instead, he climbed back up to the deck and looked out over the forest again. Birds moved through the trees now, their calls breaking the silence. The world felt alive again. But the ship remained silent, unchanged. It felt like a secret trapped in time, waiting for someone brave enough to step inside. He checked his camera. The footage was clear. Every line, every broken piece, every inch of snow on that ship was captured. He sent a message through his weak radio again, urging the team to come as soon as possible. Whatever this was, it wasn't something ordinary. It was bigger than anything he'd ever found before. For the rest of the day, he explored the outside of the ship more carefully, walking around its entire length. The back end was lodged against a rocky wall. Trees had grown up through parts of the structure, bending metal beams like soft clay. The anchor was still there, stuck in the ground like it had tried to hold on to the earth itself. He noticed faded emergency signs, rusted doors, and the remains of what must have been lifeboats long gone. Every small detail added to the mystery. How did it get here? Why was it left untouched? And why hadn't anyone found it before? The more he looked, the more questions he had. As the sun began to set again, the light turned golden and warm, touching the cold surface of the ship. He sat on a rock facing it, holding a warm drink in his hands, and thought about what might be waiting inside. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of something far bigger than he could imagine. The ship had been silent for years, maybe decades, but now someone had finally found it. The mountains had kept their secret well, but secrets don't stay hidden forever. And as the shadows grew longer and the night returned, the explorer felt a shiver run down his spine. Not from the cold, from the feeling that this place had a story to tell, a story no one was ready for. The next morning, the air felt sharper than before. Thin mist hung low across the forest floor, wrapping everything in a quiet, cold stillness. The explorer stood near the campfire, holding a warm cup between his hands, staring at the massive ship resting in the mountains. It looked even bigger in the pale morning light. The trees were still and not a single bird made a sound. It was as if the forest itself knew something strange had happened here. He adjusted his backpack straps and checked his radio again. This time the signal was clearer. A voice came through confirming that the team was only a few hours away. Relief washed over him, but it didn't last long. He kept glancing up at the ship, at its broken windows and rusted edges. He had explored many abandoned places before, but this one felt different. There was a weight to it, something he couldn't explain. As the hours passed, the sound of boots crunching snow finally broke the silence. 3 figures appeared between the trees, moving carefully with heavy gear on their backs. They greeted the explorer with quick nods, their eyes already fixed on the massive structure behind him. None of them spoke for a few seconds. Their faces said everything. They were looking at something that shouldn't exist. The oldest of the group walked forward slowly, craning his neck upward to take in the full size of the ship. He whispered a single word: "Impossible." The others just stared, stunned. No one expected the ship to be this huge. The explorer led them to a better vantage point, explaining everything he had seen the day before: the name on the hull, the broken ladder, the eerie silence. One of the team members pulled out a long metal pole and tested the ground around the ship. Snow crunched and the pole sank into soft earth. Whatever force had brought this giant here, it had left it resting solidly between 2 cliffs. There was no sign of dragging, no broken trees in the direction it might have come from. It was as if it had just fallen from the sky and landed softly. They decided to start their inspection from the lower deck. The same broken ladder the explorer had climbed now creaked under the added weight of more people. One by one, they carefully made their way up. The sound of boots on rusted metal echoed like distant drums. No one said much. Every step deeper into the mystery made the air feel heavier. The deck looked frozen in time. Thick snow covered most of the floor, but the shape of tables, benches, and railings was still clear underneath. The group walked slowly, brushing away layers of frost. Their breaths came out in white clouds, vanishing quickly in the cold air. The explorer led them to the same broken window he had peered through the night before. They all pressed close to the glass. Inside, the dining area looked like a photograph from the past. Dozens of tables were still set. White plates, now pale yellow from age, sat neatly in rows. Silverware was still on the cloth. Even the chandeliers, though cracked and dusty, still hung in place. One of the team members muttered that it looked like people had just gotten up and left in the middle of a meal. That was when they noticed something even stranger. In one corner of the dining area, a single chair was tipped over, but the snow on the floor around it was completely undisturbed. There were no footprints, no animal tracks, no sign of anyone ever coming here since the ship arrived. It was as if time had stopped inside. They decided to find a way in. A side door, hanging slightly open, offered an entry point. The hinges squeaked as they pushed it wider. A rush of cold air escaped, carrying a faint metallic smell. They stepped inside slowly, flashlights cutting through the shadows. The hallway was narrow, with faded carpet and broken wall lamps. Dust floated in the air like tiny stars. Every sound they made seemed to echo through the empty corridors. The explorer went first, scanning each room they passed. Many doors were still locked, but some hung loose on broken hinges. Behind them were cabins frozen in time, bunk beds with old blankets, cracked mirrors, suitcases left open. A hairbrush lay on one nightstand covered in a thin layer of frost. It looked like someone had just stepped away and never returned. One of the team members stopped in front of a small sign on the wall. It pointed in 3 directions: cabins, dining, and ballroom. They followed the path toward the ballroom. Their footsteps echoed down the empty hall. The deeper they went, the colder it became. It didn't make sense. The temperature outside was cold, but inside it was even lower, almost as if the ship itself was holding the chill. When they reached the ballroom, everyone froze. The room stretched wide and high, with a ceiling painted in faded gold. Massive chandeliers hung down like frozen stars. The dance floor was covered in dust and snow blown in through broken windows. A long piano sat at the far end, its keys cracked but still visible. Rows of empty chairs lined the walls. What caught their attention most was the silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. No birds, no wind, not even the creak of the ship. It felt wrong. One of the team members slowly pressed a piano key. A dull, broken sound echoed through the hall, followed by a shiver of cold air. They all glanced at each other. No one laughed. It wasn't funny. The explorer noticed something near the stage. A row of coats was still hanging on the wall, frozen stiff. He touched one carefully. The fabric cracked under his glove. These things had been here for years. Maybe decades. He tried to imagine the moment everything stopped. The music playing, people laughing, the ship sailing. Then, silence. Nothing after that. They continued to explore the upper floors. The captain's bridge was locked, but a broken window gave them a way in. The room was smaller than they expected. Dust covered everything. Old control panels sat in silence, their dials frozen in place. A captain's logbook lay open on the desk, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was rushed, almost shaky. The last entry was dated many years ago. It mentioned a sudden storm. The words grew harder to read toward the end, but one line stood out. This is not a storm. It's something else. That sent a chill through the room that no wind could match. They stared at each other, not needing to say a word. One of the team members adjusted the radio. They tried to send an update, but the signal suddenly began to crackle. A sharp burst of static filled the bridge. They stepped back in surprise. The explorer checked his compass, but the needle was spinning wildly. Something in this place was interfering with their equipment. They decided to keep moving. The lower decks had to be explored too, but the air seemed heavier the further down they went. The narrow stairway creaked loudly. Paint peeled off the walls like dry skin. A strange sound echoed through the hallway. Soft. Rhythmic. At first they thought it might be wind moving through the pipes, but it didn't sound natural. It was almost like the slow drip of water, steady and cold. Down here everything was darker. Their flashlights swept over old signs and emergency maps. The ship's engine rooms had been sealed shut with thick steel doors. It looked like someone didn't want anyone going down there. The team decided not to force it yet. It was too dangerous without proper tools. They returned to the deck after hours inside, each of them walking slower than before. The sky above the mountains had turned gray. Snow began to fall again, softly at first, then heavier. The wind picked up, making the ship groan. It sounded like the ship was breathing. The explorer sat on a crate near the side railing, staring at the falling snow. His hands were numb, but his mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the words in that logbook. It's something else. What could that mean? What had happened to the people on board? How could a ship this big disappear from the world and reappear here without a trace? The others joined him, their faces pale from the cold and from the weight of what they'd just seen. They didn't need to say much. They all felt the same thing, a quiet unease, a sense that they were standing in the middle of a story that had been waiting to be told for a very long time. Before night fell, they set up a base camp near the edge of the ship. They built a small fire and wrapped themselves in thick blankets. The snowstorm grew louder, but beneath it, they could still hear the ship creaking. It was slow and steady, like something old shifting in its sleep. They spoke quietly, sharing what they had noticed. One person had found a child's toy in one of the cabins, perfectly preserved under the frost. Another had seen faint markings on the ballroom walls, like people had scratched or written something there long ago. Each small detail added another piece to a puzzle that didn't make sense. The night dragged on slowly. The explorer lay in his sleeping bag, watching the shadows move on the ship's walls. The wind howled through the trees, but it was the occasional metallic groan that kept him awake. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just visitors here. It felt like the ship was watching them too. He closed his eyes, trying to rest, but the image of those frozen dining tables and the silent ballroom kept flashing through his mind. Somewhere, deep inside that rusting giant, answers were waiting. He didn't know what they would find, but he knew this was just the beginning. The mountain had kept this secret for too long. Now, it was slowly waking up. Snow kept falling through the night, covering the ground like a soft white blanket. By morning, the world around the mountain ship looked quiet and untouched again. The forest seemed calm, but for the small team camped near the edge of the clearing, sleep had been hard to find. The sound of the wind was one thing. The sound of the ship creaking slowly in the darkness was something else. It had a way of making the night feel longer than it really was. The explorer sat by the fire, rubbing his hands together to warm them. He stared at the giant hull in front of him. No matter how long he looked, it still didn't feel real. A ship this big shouldn't exist here. The others stirred from their sleeping bags, pulling on jackets and boots. None of them said much at first. They all had that same look in their eyes, half tired, half restless. Something inside the ship was pulling at them, even if they couldn't explain why. They gathered their gear, checked their flashlights and radios, and decided to go deeper inside. They had explored the ballroom, the dining hall, and some cabins, but there were still entire decks they hadn't touched. The lower levels remained sealed off, and the captain's log still echoed in their heads. It's something else. No one had forgotten those words. As they climbed back onto the deck, the snow cracked beneath their boots. Frost sparkled in the morning sun. The same broken door they had used the day before hung slightly open, its metal edges now frozen stiff. The explorer pushed against it, and the cold air inside rushed out like a deep breath from the ship itself. They stepped inside, their flashlights slicing through the shadows. The hallways looked the same as yesterday, dusty, silent, frozen in time. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the air seemed colder, or how their footsteps echoed just a little louder, or maybe it was because they all knew, deep down, that they were walking through someone else's story, someone who had never made it out. The group moved slowly through the cabins, looking more closely this time. The explorer stopped in front of a door that had been jammed before. With a little force, it cracked open. Inside was a small room with 2 beds. A child's doll sat on the pillow, its face pale and chipped. A book was lying on the floor, its pages stiff with ice. On the wall, faint drawings could still be seen, scratched into the wallpaper. Simple pictures of the ocean, a sun, and what looked like people waving. It was quiet, too quiet. He felt a lump in his throat as he stared at the drawings. Someone had lived in this room, laughed here, maybe cried here. And then one day they were just gone. One of the others called from down the hall. Their voice echoed softly. They had found something in the storage area. The group followed, their boots crunching on the icy floor. The storage room door was halfway open, its hinges rusted and bent. Inside were rows of metal shelves. Most of the items were covered in thick dust, but a few things were still clear. Boxes of canned food, old uniforms, and suitcases lined up neatly. It looked like someone had been preparing to leave but never did. On the far wall was a calendar, the paper yellowed with age. The last date circled was from the mid-1990s. It had been decades since anyone walked these halls. The explorer traced the date with his gloved finger. It was like stepping into a time capsule. Everything was frozen exactly as it had been left. They decided to head to the lower decks next. The metal stairway groaned beneath their weight. Their breath came out in thick clouds hanging in the air before fading. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Their flashlights lit up signs pointing to different sections of the ship: engine room, crew quarters, and medical bay. A fine layer of frost covered every surface. It wasn't just cold, it felt unnatural. When they reached the lowest door, they stopped. This was the one they had avoided the day before. It was a thick steel door, the kind meant to stay sealed during emergencies. Someone had scratched a single word into it long ago. The letters were faint but still visible. "Don't." The silence stretched for a long time. No one spoke. The wind outside howled softly through a broken vent somewhere behind them. Finally, one of the team members took a deep breath and tried the handle. It didn't move at first. Then slowly, it gave way with a long, low creak that echoed through the hallway like a warning. The door swung open, and a wave of cold, stale air rushed out. The room beyond was darker than anywhere else they had been. It felt heavier, too, like the air itself didn't want to be disturbed. Their flashlights swept across pipes, tanks, and broken panels. This must have been part of the ship's engine system. But what caught their attention wasn't the machinery. It was the row of personal items scattered on the floor. Coats, shoes, and bags, all lined up as if people had stood here waiting for something. But there was no one left. The explorer bent down and picked up a cracked wristwatch. The hands were frozen at a specific time, 3:47. He didn't know if it was day or night, but whatever had happened here, it had happened fast. People had left everything behind in that single moment. They moved further in, stepping carefully over old pipes and debris. The walls were covered in ice, glittering in the light. At the far end of the room, behind a half-open hatch, they found a smaller passage leading deeper underground, or rather, deeper into the belly of the ship. It wasn't on any of the signs they'd seen before. It was like a hidden section. Inside, they found a large control panel covered in dust. Strange wires ran across the walls, and machines they couldn't identify were bolted to the floor. It didn't look like something meant for passengers. One of the team members whispered that this didn't belong on a regular cruise ship. It looked like some kind of research equipment. But what kind of research would be hidden on a cruise ship? The explorer brushed off a panel, revealing faded labels with technical symbols. His flashlight caught something else, a stack of folders lying on a metal desk. The pages were stuck together, but he carefully peeled them apart. Most of it was just old technical notes, but one page made him stop. It mentioned atmospheric data collection and uncontrolled storm system. His heart beat faster as he read the date on the paper. It matched the date on the calendar upstairs. The day everything must have gone wrong. A sudden loud sound made everyone jump. It came from somewhere deeper in the room. A slow, echoing clang. They spun around, flashlights cutting through the dark. Nothing moved. The sound didn't come again, but the silence that followed felt different, heavy, almost like the ship itself was listening. The explorer signaled for everyone to step back. They didn't want to push too far without understanding what they had found. They closed the hatch behind them and climbed back up toward the upper decks. No one spoke as they moved. The only sounds were the creaking of the metal under their boots and the soft hiss of their breath. When they finally reached the open deck, the cold wind hit their faces like a slap. The sky had turned a dull gray. Snowflakes drifted lazily down. The ship loomed over them like a ghost from another world. They sat down on crates near their small campfire, their faces pale and thoughtful. They had found something inside that didn't belong on a passenger ship. And that meant the story of this vessel was far more complicated than anyone imagined. The explorer pulled the folded papers from his bag and placed them on the ground. Everyone leaned closer. The faded ink was hard to read, but together they pieced out enough words to understand the basic idea. This ship had been part of some kind of experimental mission, something to do with storms, the atmosphere, and an event that had spiraled out of control. No wonder it had disappeared. No wonder no one had found it for so long. The team sat in silence for a long time. The forest was quiet again, and the ship loomed behind them like a giant waiting to speak. The explorer stared at the steel hull, his breath fogging the air. A cruise ship in the mountains was already a mystery, but now they had stumbled onto something much bigger. As the light faded, they built the fire higher. The warmth didn't do much against the cold, but it gave them something to hold on to. The explorer kept replaying everything in his mind. The doll on the bed, the drawings on the wall, the scratched word on the steel door, the frozen wristwatch, and that strange equipment hidden below. Night crept in slowly. The wind started to hum against the metal walls of the ship, almost like a low, steady song. The team huddled closer to the fire. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it. The more they uncovered, the stranger this story became, and something deep inside the explorer told him they were nowhere near the full truth yet. Just before turning in for the night, he walked toward the ship one last time. His flashlight swept across the frozen deck. For a brief second, he thought he saw something in one of the upper windows, a shadow, a flicker of movement. But when he blinked, it was gone. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was the snow. Or maybe, just maybe, the ship wasn't as empty as it seemed. He stood there for a long moment, breathing in the freezing air, staring up at the silent giant in the mountains. Whatever had happened here had left deep marks, not just on the ship but in the air itself. And this time he wasn't just curious. He was determined. He was going to find the truth no matter how long it took or how strange it got, because the story of the ship wasn't over. It was only just beginning to speak. The air inside the ship had grown heavier. The deeper they went, the colder it became, almost as if the metal walls themselves were holding on to the chill of another time. Every sound echoed strangely. The footsteps of the group bounced off the steel corridors and seemed to follow behind them like a shadow that refused to be left alone. The group had already explored several upper decks, finding rooms frozen in time. Now they were standing at the entrance to the lower engineering section, a narrow staircase leading into darkness. The handrails were damp with a thin layer of cold moisture, and the steps creaked with every move. Even though they had bright flashlights, the darkness below swallowed most of the light, making it look like a black hole waiting for them. No one spoke for a moment. Everyone just stared down the stairs, listening to the quiet hum of the wind outside and the distant groaning of metal. Finally, the lead explorer, the same man who had first found the ship, took a deep breath and started descending. The others followed closely behind, each one aware that something about this part of the ship felt different. Their flashlights revealed pipes running along the ceiling and walls, thick cables frozen in place by time. Some of the pipes were cracked open and thin icicles hung down like sharp teeth. The floor had small puddles of water where snow had melted through weak seams. The air smelled old, like rust, dust, and something chemical hidden beneath. Halfway down, one of the team members whispered that their flashlight was flickering. Another said their radio had lost its signal again. It wasn't the first time this happened since they entered the ship. Something inside was interfering with their equipment. Compasses spun in circles, digital clocks reset themselves, and radio static filled the silence. When they reached the bottom of the staircase, they found a long hallway that curved slightly, almost like it was trying to lead them somewhere. The walls were lined with old warning signs. Some were written in faded letters, others were almost completely peeled away. A few signs had symbols none of them recognized. It wasn't the usual ship maintenance area they expected to find. It felt like something secret had been built here. At the end of the hallway, a heavy steel door stood out from the rest. It wasn't like the other doors on the ship. It had thick bolts, extra locks, and warning stripes painted across it. A small control panel was mounted beside it, but it was dead. No lights, no power. The group gathered in front of the door, and for a long moment, no one moved. It was clear that this door wasn't meant to be opened by just anyone. The lead explorer ran his gloved hand over the metal surface. It was colder than the rest of the ship. He noticed a small circular handle near the center, similar to those used on secure bulkheads. With a little effort, he began to turn it. It resisted at first, then slowly gave way with a low metallic groan that echoed down the hall. The door finally cracked open, letting out a gust of stale, icy air. It smelled like something had been trapped behind it for a very long time. The group pointed their flashlights into the opening and froze. What they saw was not part of a normal cruise ship. Inside was a large hidden room filled with metal equipment they didn't recognize. Huge cylindrical tanks lined the walls, connected by pipes and wires that ran across the ceiling. A strange machine stood in the center, covered with a dusty tarp. Several old control panels surrounded it with switches and meters that hadn't moved in decades. Papers were scattered across tables. A single chair sat overturned near one of the consoles. The entire place felt like a secret laboratory buried in the heart of a passenger ship. One of the group members walked toward the nearest console and gently brushed away a layer of dust. Underneath, the words, "Restricted Operations," were stamped in bold letters. Another panel had labels that mentioned weather patterns, pressure levels, and energy output. It didn't make sense. Why would a cruise ship need equipment like this? The lead explorer opened one of the metal cabinets against the wall. Inside were files stored in plastic sleeves. The pages were yellowed, but the words were still clear. The documents described tests with something called atmospheric modulation. They mentioned coordinates over the open ocean, weather measurements, and the presence of scientific teams on board. The team grew quiet. A cruise ship was supposed to be for tourists, swimming pools, fancy dinners, and entertainment. But this wasn't that kind of ship. It was something else entirely. As they kept searching, they found more evidence of hidden operations. There were old ID cards with no personal names, only numbers. There were shipping labels on crates that didn't match any commercial port records. And the most unsettling detail, everything looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. A cup with dried liquid still sat beside one of the control panels. Pens were still uncapped. It was as if people had been working here one moment and disappeared the next. Someone gently pulled the tarp off the machine in the center of the room. A cloud of dust floated up. Underneath was a strange metallic structure about the size of a small car. It was covered in panels with faded labels and switches. Some parts were corroded, but the overall structure looked like it was built to last. It had an array of nozzles pointing upward, like it was designed to push something into the air. One of the researchers guessed it might have been part of a weather experiment. Another thought it looked military. The truth was, none of them had ever seen anything like it. Then came another surprise. Behind the machine there was a narrow metal ladder leading to a lower hatch. The team exchanged nervous glances. They had already gone deeper than planned, but their curiosity wouldn't let them stop. Slowly, they climbed down the ladder. The space below was cramped, almost like a storage bay. Rows of locked containers were lined up on both sides. Some had broken seals. A few had labels with codes and hazard symbols. When one of the containers was carefully opened, it revealed metal canisters, still sealed tight. Each one had numbers engraved on it along with the words "for controlled release only." No one knew what was inside, but it was clear this wasn't something meant for passengers. The group decided to take photos of everything. The lead explorer recorded every corner of the room, making sure there was proof of what they had found. He knew what this meant. The world outside had no idea this ship held something like this. The more they looked around, the more they realized this wasn't just a small experiment. It looked like a major operation. Charts on the wall showed global maps with lines drawn over storm-prone areas. Weather data from decades ago was pinned up next to photos of the ocean. Some notes mentioned energy bursts, pressure fields, and unknown test subjects. Their radios remained dead. Every attempt to call their base failed. It was as if the ship itself was swallowing their signals. The temperature continued to drop the deeper they stayed. Then, while checking the far side of the lab, one of the team members found a large folder locked inside a metal drawer. It took some time to break it open, but when they finally did, the papers inside were unlike the others. These weren't just scientific notes. These were official documents stamped with layers of classification markings. They mentioned a mission date from the early 1990s. The ship had been part of a secret program. It was sent out under the cover of being a regular passenger vessel, but it was carrying advanced technology meant to study or possibly control weather systems. One section of the documents described a sudden atmospheric shift during one of the tests. A massive storm appeared out of nowhere, larger and more violent than anything expected. The last recorded message from the crew spoke about losing control of the systems. Then all communications stopped. The team stood in silence as they realized they might be standing at the center of that story, the very place where something went terribly wrong. The lead explorer carefully folded the most important pages and put them in a waterproof bag. He didn't know who would believe this story, but he knew someone had to see it. They stayed in the lab longer than planned, moving from one corner to another, documenting everything they could. But a faint sound made them stop. Somewhere above them, the ship groaned again, but this time it sounded different. It wasn't just the wind. It was as if something heavy had shifted. They hurried back up the ladder, through the lab, and out into the hallway. The temperature had dropped even more, and a fine mist hung in the air. One of their flashlights flickered, then went out completely. The group moved quickly toward the staircase, not wanting to be trapped down there. But as they turned the last corner, the lead explorer looked back at the sealed room they had just left. He knew what they had found was bigger than anything they expected. The ship wasn't just a mystery stuck in the mountains. It was holding secrets someone had tried very hard to bury. As they climbed the stairs, each step felt heavier than the last. They didn't just carry their gear anymore. They carried the weight of the truth they had uncovered. Outside, the light from the sun was fading fast, turning the snow-covered landscape a pale blue. The cold wind cut through their clothes, but none of them cared about the cold anymore. All they could think about was what was hidden inside that ship for all those years and why no one ever came looking for it. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they knew this was just the beginning. Something about this discovery was going to change everything.